What's this? 2 episodes of Digressing and Sidequesting in the same month? Is the world ending? Nope, I'm just getting paid to do this one. But I promise it's still a good episode. A while back, I had a video planned about the history of MMORPGs and how their mechanics evolved over time, but MatPat sort of beat me to it with an episode of Game Theory that covered a lot of the things I wanted to cover, so I spent the next 17 hours writing him a nasty email that I didn't send because I'm a wimp, and I wasn't necessarily mad at him per se. I just really wanted to make an episode about MMOs, and 80% of the stuff I wanted to say was already covered in that episode. So I crumpled up my MMO script and threw it in the trash can and forgot about the whole thing. That is, until an email hit my inbox. It was from En Masse Entertainment, and they said, "Hey Ronnie, would you be interested in being able to afford food next month?" And I said, "Yes, I'd be incredibly interested in being able to afford food next month." And so they said, "Great, make an episode of Digressing and Sidequesting about MMO combat." And I said, "Combat! That's something that MatPat didn't cover! Ha! That's it!" And so I spent the next several weeks researching MMO and online combat, and now we have this video. So to talk about MMO combat, I actually need to talk about online combat in general. Online combat is actually a really difficult problem to solve. With a single player game, you're really only limited by your own computer. But in an online game, you have to negotiate between several different people with several different setups and internet speeds, all occupying the same play space. And you have to figure out some way to make the entire experience coherent and fluid for every user. The first online gaming was done peer-to-peer. So say there's 4 of us in a game, all of our computers would be directly connected and synchronized with each other. Everybody's computers were sharing information with everybody else's computers. So if you press W to move your character forward, that key press would also go to everybody else's machine. Their machines would calculate that, and once everybody's machine got the input and agreed that they got the input, then your character would move forward on everybody's machine. The problem with this setup is the game can only run as fast as the slowest connection, since every computer in the group is synchronized, and they all have to agree on who's inputting what and when. This worked great for local games or if everybody playing happened to have similar speeds, but if someone in the match were in another country, that single slow connection would result in everybody's game getting bogged down because their computers were constantly waiting on the slowpoke to agree on all the inputs and calculations. In slower paced games like internet poker, this isn't a huge problem, but in something like a fast paced FPS, the story is quite a bit different. The second setup that came about was client-server, where instead of being directly connected to each other, all 4 players would be directly connected to a central machine called the server. If you press W on your computer, your key press would get sent to the server would calculate and resolve everything, and once it finished, it would send the data to you and all the other players, so all of you would see your character move forward. The advantage of this setup is if you have one slow player in the game, they're not slowing everybody else down. The disadvantage of this system is if you were the poor soul who had a slow connection, it could take half a second or more between when you press W and when your character would finally begin to move on everybody's screen. So you'd press the button, wait for the signal to go from your computer to your ISP, to the server would calculate it, confirm the input, and then send the signal to everybody else. And then finally your character would move. You're essentially a sitting duck unless you have a good connection to the server. On top of that, you also had to wait for the data from all the other players to reach you as well. If your connection wasn't fast, then everybody else might appear to be teleporting and zipping around you. You'd essentially be a stationary target that couldn't harm a fly, because everybody else is moving too fast. Unless you had a good connection, an online game using this system was completely unplayable. Id Software ran into this exact same problem when they first released Quake. People who had access to broadband internet had a blast playing it online right out the gate, but the vast majority of people who owned Quake in 1996 only had access to dial-up modems, and just couldn't play the game online because it was so choppy and slow. So Id Software decided to hunker down and figure out a way to solve this problem, and what they came up with revolutionized online gaming. It was called client-side prediction. The game would appear to play smooth on your screen even if things were getting choppy underneath the hood. Instead of having to wait on the server to confirm your input before it happened on screen, if you press W to move forward, your client still sent the message to the server, but before it even heard back from the server, your character would immediately start moving on your screen. Everybody else is still seeing where you were a moment ago, and they need to wait until the server gets your message and sends it off to them. But on your screen, all of your inputs are happening immediately. Conversely, you're seeing everybody else where they were a moment ago, and you need to wait on the server to update their positions on your screen. But on their screen, everything is happening right as they press their buttons. Everybody is universally on a slight delay relative to each other. Short enough that it doesn't impact gameplay, but large enough that everybody's inputs have enough time to reach the server, get calculated, and get sent to everybody else playing. On the old setup, a player would send their data to the server, and they'd have to wait until the server got the data, calculated it, and sent it to everybody else playing before the player would see anything happen on their own screen. In this new setup, a player is still sending their data to the server, and the server is still calculating it and sending the data to everybody else, but the player doesn't have to wait until they hear back from the server. If they press W, they move immediately, and the players around them aren't zipping or teleporting because the server is sending the player a continuous stream of data about all the other players that the server already finished calculating moments ago. This means that even if you have a slow connection, you can still remain competitive and everything on your end appears to play smoothly. The old client-server setup was like you were riding on a train as the train tracks were being built. You ride the train to the end of the tracks, and then the server would have to feverishly work to make the next stretch of tracks, and you'd have to wait until it finished before you could continue onwards. And then you'd do it again. Ride the tracks to the end, stop and wait until the server finishes the next stretch of tracks before you could continue onwards, and repeat. With client-side prediction, the server has a head start on everything and has built a good chunk of the tracks ahead of you, so you can coast cleanly without having to worry about all the starts and stops. While this solves a lot of problems, it's not perfect. There are edge cases where, say, you're on a fast connection and you sprint behind a corner right as somebody with a slower connection shoots at you. On your screen, you're already around the corner, but on their screen, because of the delay, you haven't run around the corner yet, and they got a direct hit. What should happen here? Does the server register the hit and you get shot from around the corner? Or does the server register it as a miss and their bullet goes right through you? What most developers will do is they'll register it as a hit, and they might actually play a specific death animation that covers this discrepancy up a little bit. If you've ever seen the weird Call of Duty death animation where your character is running and suddenly their feet fly out from under them and they smack the ground flat on their back, that's what that is. This is an edge case and it rarely happens, but seeing your bullet pass right through somebody is easier to notice than being shot right as you turn a corner. This is also how kill cams work. They're always done from the shooter's perspective regardless of what the target saw on their screen. Another problem is popping. Maybe you've played an online game where in the middle of battle, you turn a corner into a clearing, fire a couple bullets, crouch, and then suddenly you're popped all the way back to before you ran around the corner, almost like you got sent back in time. That game was using client-side prediction, and your client, for whatever reason, got desynchronized from the server, and the server had to pop you back and correct your position relative to all the other players. This sort of stuff has actually been happening the entire time you've been playing the game. The server is constantly popping you and other people to slightly different positions, but it's usually not as dramatic unless there's a huge lag spike, and the server has to immediately fix something that went horribly, horribly wrong. You get these occasional pops, and sure, they're annoying, but 99% of your playtime looks fast and fluid. The solution worked great for FPSs and other games, but historically it hasn't been available to MMOs, because MMOs introduce a whole new set of problems, namely because of that first M, massive. Instead of supporting 20 players for a 10-on-10 deathmatch, an MMO server needs to keep track of thousands of players all doing anything from fighting to gathering to trading to crafting all at once. Fast-paced active combat wasn't a viable option for MMOs due to the sheer number of people occupying their servers, so they had to deliberately make their combat systems less active. This is why, for a very long time, combat in things like WoW are hotbar and numbers-based rather than being twitch and reflex-based. The technology just didn't allow for smooth and real-time combat across the entire server. That's not to say that less active combat systems are necessarily worse. It's just that less active combat was literally the only option available for massive multiplayer games. But that's starting to change. Newer MMOs are starting to feature play spaces that favor much more active systems, where instead of melee range and miss rates, you have hitboxes and enemies that physically dodge your attacks in real time. Technology has gotten to the point where active combat is becoming a viable option for MMOs, and it's really exciting, and the sorts of adjustments and tweaks designers have to make to the usual MMO formula when they implement an active combat system like this is fascinating. Terra, for instance, and I'm gonna have to use Terra for instance because it's the one I'm most familiar with since I spent the last month playing it because they paid me. But Terra, for instance, I honestly didn't understand a bunch of the design choices Terra made when I first started the game. Why do I have separate resolve and mana bars as a warrior? Why does my resolve bar drain so quickly when I dodge? Why can't most of these healing items be used in combat? Why do the healing items that can be used in combat take an entire 60 seconds to cool down? A lot of it was baffling until I was around level 20 trying to take out a basilisk on my own, and suddenly a bunch of their design decisions made sense. Defensive skills like dodging and blocking use up resolve, while offensive skills refill resolve but use up mana. So combat becomes a balancing act of trying to manage these two resources while also dealing damage and not getting hit. Enemies have tells, so you know when and where to dodge, but you don't want to overuse your dodge because you might end up with an empty resolve bar, and won't be able to roll out of the way when you really need to. And you don't want to overuse your offensive skills either because you might end up with 0 MP when a great opportunity to deal damage comes up. Healing items in Terra have a long cooldown time, so you can't lean on them as a crutch. It's really up to you to dodge, block, and pick your shots strategically when you're facing down an enemy. Managing hit points and mana, stepping into a rhythm of offense and defense, keeping track of the area around you so you don't accidentally corner yourself. Fights can get really cool when you're up against a strong enough enemy. And other classes play entirely differently, ranging from support priests to glass cannon sorcerers to whatever this is. While previous MMOs definitely required skill, and you needed to pick your shots and use certain skills at certain times, in Terra, that stuff is happening at a much more rapid clip, and so it feels more like an action game. The best way I can put it is that in something like WoW, it comes down to timing, while in Terra, it comes down to reflexes, and it's a weird brain shift you have to make when you're exploring the game. It's impressive that they were able to pull off a system like this considering the sort of networking hurdles you need to jump over in order to make a play space like this possible. Active combat is a step in a very interesting direction for MMOs, and now that it's becoming viable, I can't wait to see more. Hey guys, Ronnie Edwards here. If you liked the video, you can watch more here. Just click on the I thingy. And also, if you didn't like the video, because I got paid to do it, then you can check out Game Theory. You probably don't like me anymore.